Okay, so getting going here then with Central America. So Central America is this region of 7 countries that connects North and South America together, right? So if we're looking here at the screen, these 7 countries that appear on your map, these are the 7 countries of Central America. And again, Central America, it's a region that's a part of North America, right? So it includes the countries from north to south of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Okay, very similar to like Mexico and South America. These countries have um, a very prevalent Spanish culture, and Spanish is the primary language spoken there. Okay, but understand that when we're talking about Central America, we're referring to the region of these 7 countries. And again, very similar to Mexico in the sense that the Spanish culture is very prevalent there. Okay, kind of continuing on here. Oops. And talking about physical regions. So Central America, there is a basically a chain of mountains that kind of runs right down the middle part of Central America, um, right down the middle of Central America, and it kind of again it makes the terrain very um, obviously rugged, and because of these mountains, it makes transportation and such kind of difficult all throughout Central America. My wife had gone on vacation in Costa Rica a couple of years ago. And again, Costa Rica, I know my map is kind of cut out here, but Costa Rica is right here. If you can kind of see where my cursor is. And there is a chain of mountains that runs, again, basically right down the smack dab middle of the country. And that caused some issues in getting from the airport to where they were staying, and it was only like a 50-mile drive. Which you're thinking in the United States, oh, driving 50 miles is going to take 45 minutes or something along those lines on the interstate. Well, to drive that amount of time in Costa Rica, it took them like 5 or 6 hours because the roads weren't very good. They had to drive a little bit through the mountains, which kind of made things interesting as well. But understand that basically this mountain range, it kind of makes life there. It can make it difficult and a little bit different than what we're used to. Um, so keep that in mind. And talk about the Caribbean lowlands. In talking about the Caribbean lowlands, um, that's going to be kind of like the side that's on the eastern side of the mountains that's closer to like the Caribbean Sea and such. And most of that area, it's very like very stereotypical, very tropical, where you see rainforests and things along those lines. And again, that's on the eastern side here of Central America. And then on the western side of the mountains, that's your what you call the Pacific Coastal Plain, more of a savanna type climate, um, more of a savanna type climate, and yeah, Dylan, we're recording. Okay, oops. But more of a savanna type climate where again it's mostly dry year round, except there's a wet season, and that's on the Pacific side of these mountains, right? So on the Pacific Ocean side of Central America. And talking about some of the people and such, again, the Native Americans, the Native Americans have lived in this area the longest. As far as where they live, the country of Guatemala, you see a very large Native American population there. And all throughout Central America, really, you see a high native population. You also see a European and a mestizo population all throughout Central America. Again, the mestizos are people who are descendants of Europeans and Native Americans. And generally speaking, those that are white, European, or mestizo, they're kind of in a higher social class in Central America than, say, those that are native. Variety of reasons for that. But again, like we had said, all throughout Central America, Spanish is a very common language, and the largest European population lives in the country of Costa Rica. There are some Africans that also live in Central America. Most of those people were descendants of slaves who were brought to Central America by the Spanish conquistadors, or potentially those who migrated from the Caribbean islands. Again, all throughout, again, a very sad practice, but throughout the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, when Europeans would go to places like Central America or come to places like Central America and the Caribbean islands. What would happen is those African Americans would eventually make their way to Central America for a variety of reasons. And then the other thing to understand here too is that, oops. And then the other thing to understand here too is that most people who live in Central America are generally very poor. Most of the population is just impoverished, and there's a variety of reasons for that. And again, it kind of makes life there a little bit different than, say, what we would be used to seeing in the United States. So understand that when we're talking about whatever country it is in Central America, is that most of that population is going to be fairly impoverished. And then getting on to economic activities and such here. Farming obviously is a huge practice. Most families practice what you call subsistence farming. Subsistence farming simply refers to the idea that people are planting and harvesting crops enough to feed their families, and then enough to sell at a farmer's market to make a little bit of money so they can plant more crops. But that's subsistence farming. It's very small scale, just enough to feed a singular family and enough to make enough money to support that family. Plantation farming, again, that also occurs in Central America, and that's generally the very small wealthy population that does exist in the Central American countries. That wealthy population, generally they're plantation farmers, so they own several thousand acres of land, and usually they employ people to do the work for them. Those people get paid a very small wage. There's also some corporations that own these plantation farms in Central America. So that's also, again, where you see some of these more wealthy folk coming from. But again, that wealthy population in Central America is very, very small. Some of the main crops that come out of Central America include coffee, cotton, and bananas. And then another major kind of economic source for the region, and really more so, I guess, for the country of Panama, is the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal is this structure that was built starting in the 1800s, actually, by the French, and then completed by the United States in 1914. But the Panama Canal is this huge structure that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. So basically what happened is when they constructed the canal is they basically cut smack dab down the middle of the country of Panama, and we're able to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that way. So that saves a lot of time on travel. Now, obviously, having to go from ocean to ocean, major, transportation ships or shipping vessels, they can cut right through the Panama Canal, and ends up cutting several thousand miles off the journey between the oceans. And again, understand that the United States completed most of the construction on this. So the United States had a very strong presence in Panama right up until the turn of the new millennium. Right up to the 1999, the United States had a huge presence in Panama, which also caused some tension there. But since 1999, the Panama Canal has been controlled by the country of Panama, and a lot of the people who live in Panama actually work for the canal, whether as maintenance workers or however. Okay, and then our last thing here on Central America, just really quick, is, again, we talked about how there is a variety of social issues in the Central American countries between rich and poor. That also brings some political conflict to the region. And most of the countries in Central America at some point in time have had some sort of political conflict where it leads to people dying and other really bad things. And a lot of this political conflict, it goes back to a few different things. Is that there is a shortage of farmland in Central America. Again, most of the area is very mountainous. So some of that soil is not ideal. So again, to find usable soil is kind of a tough thing. A lot of the usable soil that does exist is taken up by these huge plantations, so that doesn't really leave a whole lot for anybody else to use. And so because of that, and that limited farmland that is available in Central America, that sometimes leads to food shortages, especially amongst the more so impoverished population. And obviously that is not an ideal situation, and that leads to one of the things people really enjoy is food. And when you don't have that, it's a tough deal, and that leads to tension. Also, because Central America is maybe a lot of these countries are not necessarily the most developed, there's a limited access to technology, especially when it comes to farming. So in most cases, unless it's a plantation farm, you're not going to see the modern machinery or some of those things. A lot of the farming is still done by hand without, mechanical machinery, which makes life, difficult. And then really the last thing here, and again, this is maybe the greatest source of political conflict in Central America, is that a lot of the governments that have been in place, they really try to serve the interests of the wealthy over the interests of the poor, and that leads to political corruption, or has led to political corruption, especially when you're talking that the vast majority of the Central American countries have a much higher impoverished population. So when you have a government that's really only trying to cater to the wealthy, that makes everybody else, for the most part, really upset. And that leads to things like revolts and civil wars and things of that nature. So countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, they've had some really well-known civil wars in the past, kind of going back to some of these political conflicts. And now in addition to that, because of the location of Central American countries, they're also susceptible to things like tropical storms and that type of thing. So that also makes life very difficult, especially when you're talking nations that are already not very developed and maybe don't have the best infrastructure or road system and things like that in place. Okay, so keep all that in mind. I'm going to stop my recording here.